Okay guys, welcome back to part 2 of our tissues lecture. Now, we've spent the last part talking about epithelial tissue, and you learned about all the different kinds of epithelial tissue, squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and transitional, all those etc. kinds of epithelial tissue. When we go over this, keep in mind the definition of tissue, right? A tissue is where you have cells working together for a common function, and that is certainly true of connective tissue. We're talking about cells, and these cells actually produce a substance called extracellular matrix, or sometimes people call it ground substance, and this is the stuff that is going to be it actually serves a lot of different purposes, but in general it's kind of the stuffing. So imagine you're baking your Thanksgiving turkey, and you put the stuffing in there, and that kind of rounds it out and fills it and holds one side to the other, etc. That's kind of what connective tissue is all about. So connective tissue connects one structure to another, and it comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. So CT, connective tissue, is the glue or the filler of the body. And you can see this. So for example, one kind of connective tissue is called adipose tissue. That's your fat, and of course we're all stuffed up with fat. Well, some of us more than others, like myself. But you know, it's still cushioning, but that cushioning is also cushioning for our organs. We have connective tissue that is in our joints that provides, it acts as a shock absorber. So it's stuffing, it's a filler, it's a glue. So some of the common examples of connective tissue are tendons, right? So you guys know what tendons do. They secure muscles to bones, so that's a kind of connective tissue. Ligaments secure bone to bone. We already said the body fat, the adipose, which you see over here. And cartilage, right? Cartilage. Where do you find cartilage? Well, you find it all over the place, right? In your nose. You find it in your ear. You know, babies have lots of cartilage. They haven't had enough ossification yet, right? They haven't gotten their cartilage converting to bone yet. But everything you see on this slide are different types of connective tissue. And so the idea is, by the end of this lecture, I hope that if I've done my job right and you've studied, which is your job, you'll be able to actually look at a tissue specimen and identify what kind of connective tissue you're dealing with and what the function of that connective tissue is. Form and function, right? That's the theme of A&P. So let's first take some general connective tissue and look at what some of the structural components are that we might find in connective tissue. So this diagram right here gives you kind of a good overview of what all the stuff is in the stuffing. We said ground substance. Ground substance is, it could be made up of several things, a variety of things. We'll go over the specifics soon, but basically it's compounds, it's molecules. It could be complex sugars, polysaccharides. It could be proteins, a combination of those things, and fluid. But that's called ground substance. It also has a lot of protein fibers all through it. So connective tissue is fibrous. And if I get out my handy dandy pen here, let me see if how my handwriting will act today. Fibrous. Fibrous meaning full of fibers. And in this case, the fibers are made of proteins. And depending on the kind of connective tissue you're dealing with, there are different kinds of fibers. So some are thin, some are thick, some are dark, some are light. So we're going to be talking about these different kinds of fibers. So we have elastic fibers. We have collagen fibers, which you've probably heard about before, right? You know, people that get their faces treated, their skin treatments on their faces. They use products that supposedly help, with the collagen restoration, etc. Reticular fibers. So these are three types of fibers. Protein fibers. They're made out of proteins, which are made of amino acids. And these different fibers, in their different combinations, make the different kinds of connective tissue. Now, this is a tissue, so it's full of cells. So you also have cells that you find throughout connective tissue. And one of the main kinds you'll notice is something called a fibroblast. And of course, fibro means fiber. Blast refers to a cell that's doing something. So these are cells that actually produce fibers. So they're actually creating the ground substance, and they're creating these protein fibers. You might find some fat cells in there. So this would be an adipocyte, a cell that creates fat. And you have immune cells like this macrophage here. So later on, when you learn about the immune system, you'll learn about macrophages. That I call them the Pac-Man cells because they like to chomp, chomp, chomp and eat things like bacteria. So those are macrophage, literally means big eater. And you'll find blood vessels all through the extracellular matrix. So you got blood vessels through there. And other cells called mesenchymal cells. So these are different kinds of cells you'll find in there, but the fibroblasts really are the ones that are kind of the most apparent when you're looking at connective tissues. But all of these fibers and the ground substance together make up your extracellular matrix. Okay, so that's your extracellular matrix. And it's really the look of the extracellular matrix that allows you to identify the different types of connective tissue. Okay, so just to summarize again, we have our protein fibers. These are elastic fibers, collagen fibers, and reticular fibers. So say that with me: elastic, collagen, and reticular. You have your ground substance, which is made up of stuff, of compounds. So we got proteins in there, we got complex carbohydrates in there, you have fluid like water, of course, and you also have some salts in there. So this ground substance with our protein fibers creates our extracellular matrix. So you'll hear us use the term extracellular matrix all the time throughout A&P, especially when we get into physiology and we're talking about the movement of molecules in and out of cell membranes. Well, if you're outside of the cell, you're in the extracellular matrix, right? So just get used to that term, get used to the term ground substance, because we say those things all the time. Okay, so now let's go over the functions of connective tissue. And you see right here a lovely picture of some connective tissue. And again, very soon you'll be able to identify what kind of connective tissue we are looking at there. But like so many things in our body, like the epithelial layers we were talking about before, connective tissue is a protective tissue. In many cases, it's providing physical protection. Now, whereas the epithelial layer, for example, on your skin is protecting you from the outside, your connective tissue is really providing internal protection. When you're bending over, you don't want your liver like smashing in to another organ like your intestine, right? You need some kind of stuffing in the middle to protect you from the friction that would be generated and the trauma, the impact. So connective tissue can do that, can serve a protective role. And as we said, your adipose tissue, your fat, is definitely protective, right? It's going to cushion your organs, among other things. Now, connective tissue can also provide a support or a structural framework. So one of the things you'll learn in a little bit is one kind of connective tissue, believe it or not, is bone. You're like, bone is connective tissue? That doesn't seem to make sense, but it is. It's kind of the far extreme of the kinds of connective tissue you can get. And that bone obviously has a support or a structural function to it, right? You have your leg bones, and gravity is constantly pushing down on your body, and you're constantly walking or running or jumping or doing what it is that we do, and that's putting a lot of pressure on our body. And so we would just collapse and become this like blob if we didn't have those structural components to keep us upright and keep us intact. And so bone is an example of a structural connective tissue. As we said before, some connective tissues like tendons and ligaments have a binding function. They're actually binding one kind of tissue to another tissue. In the case of tendons, you're binding muscle tissue to bone tissue. And in the case of ligaments, you're binding bone tissue to bone tissue. So they can serve a binding function. You'll also learn about connective tissue that binds to the epithelial layer. So again, a binding or a glue-like function to it. In the case of adipose tissue, it's not just about protection and stuffing, it's also about storage. So many of you already know that fat is a storage mechanism. It's, you ate a little too much pizza the night before, whatever you didn't digest and use as fuel to create energy in your cells, whatever you didn't digest is going to be stored as fat for a rainy day when you go through some kind of starvation mechanism. That's why yo-yo diets don't work, right? You starve yourself, okay, you lose weight, but then as soon as you start eating again, your body says, I'm not going to let you starve me like that again. Whatever you eat, I'm going to store as fat so that I'll be ready for the next time you decide to go yo-yoing with me, right? Okay, now here's something even crazier. Okay, we talked about bone as being kind of an extreme of connective tissue. And in fact, let me see if I can write a little thing here that will kind of put this in perspective. So we're going to create a little spectrum here for connective tissue. So we already talked about bone. So let's write bone here. Okay, so there's our bone. But at the other extreme of the spectrum, we have blood. Blood. So I'm going to put like this little arrow here to represent the spectrum. We have blood. So we got bone, we got blood. Yes, blood is a connective tissue. Now, that seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? Like you think of connective tissue as connecting things, but blood is a connective tissue. And one of the functions of connective tissue is transport. Well, obviously, blood is a transporter, right? Blood contains hemoglobin, carries oxygen to our cells, takes carbon dioxide away, carries nutrients. So blood is a fluid connective tissue. It's for transport. So bone is for structural, supportive function. At the other extreme, blood is for transport. And then there's everything in the middle. So you can also say that connective tissue supports an immune function. Immune function, really? Yes, because think about it. Blood also has white blood cells, which are your immune cells, right? It helps to fight off the bad guys that get in there. So we already talked about macrophages, chomp, 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 eating the bad bacteria and the bad critters that are there. Well, macrophages are often carried through blood, and they like to settle in other types of connective tissue. So indeed, connective tissue can have an immune function. And in fact, one of the places where you'll find connective tissue is in your lymphatic organs, like your spleen and your lymph nodes, right? These are places where immune cells are produced, and you'll actually see a special kind of typical connective tissue that we'll talk about soon, or that I just you just heard the word, but the actual tissue called reticular connective tissue. Physical protection, support, structural framework, binding of structures, storage, transport, and immune protection. Those are some of the main functions. So we're here at AP Revealed. Let's go ahead and go back to our tissues section here. And if we go to movies, all content, we're going to go to the connective tissue overview. Here we go.
Connective tissue is diverse, abundant, and widely distributed through the body. Its primary functions include structural support, binding structures together, fat storage, exchange of nutrients and metabolic waste, and defense and protection. All connective tissues share three basic components: cells, protein fibers, and ground substance. Together, the protein fibers and ground substance form the extracellular matrix. The proportions of these components, in addition to different cells and protein fibers, help define the various categories of connective tissue. In the adult, connective tissue can be divided into three broad categories: connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. There are two basic subcategories of connective tissue proper: loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. Loose connective tissue has abundant ground substance with scattered cells and loosely arranged protein fibers. By comparison, dense connective tissue has abundant, tightly packed fibers, but relatively few cells and little ground substance. Loose connective tissue can be subdivided into areolar, adipose, and reticular connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue is found in the subcutaneous layer and around organs. It has a gel-like ground substance, numerous blood vessels, and scattered cells known as fibroblasts. Adipose connective tissue is found in subcutaneous tissue and around some organs. It is composed of closely packed adipocytes or fat cells. Reticular connective tissue forms the stroma, a connective tissue framework, of lymph nodes, the spleen, the thymus, and bone marrow. It is composed of a network of branched collagen fibers, known as reticular fibers, with scattered fibroblasts and leukocytes, or white blood cells, embedded in a gel-like ground substance. Dense connective tissue can be subdivided into dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic connective tissue. Dense regular connective tissue forms tendons and most ligaments. It is composed of densely packed parallel collagen fibers with fibroblasts between the layers. There is little ground substance. Dense irregular connective tissue is found in the dermis, periosteum and perichondrium, and the capsule of organs. This type of connective tissue is composed predominantly of randomly arranged collagen fibers with fibroblasts interspersed. There is more ground substance than found in dense regular connective tissue. Elastic tissue is found in the walls of elastic arteries, the trachea and bronchi, and the vocal cords. This type of connective tissue is composed predominantly of branching elastic fibers, with fibroblasts in some spaces between the fibers. Elastic fibers, formed by the protein elastin, stretch under tension and then return to their original shape when tension is released. Supporting connective tissue can be subdivided into cartilage and bone. Cartilage has a semi-solid extracellular matrix that allows flexibility, whereas the solid matrix of bone is more rigid and provides greater support. There are three types of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most common type. It is found on the articular surfaces of synovial joints. It also forms the cartilage of the larynx, trachea, and nose. Chondrocytes, or mature cartilage cells, are found within small spaces called lacunae that are scattered irregularly in the extracellular matrix. Collagen fibrils are present within the matrix but not visible in the light microscope. A perichondrium, a dense irregular connective tissue sheath, overlies most cartilage. Elastic cartilage is found in the external ear and in the epiglottis. It contains abundant elastic fibers, which form a web-like mesh around lacunae that contain chondrocytes. Like hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage usually has a perichondrium. Fibrocartilage is found in intervertebral discs, the pubic symphysis, and the menisci of the knee joint. It contains numerous irregular bundles of collagen fibers. The sparse ground substance contains chondrocytes within lacunae that are frequently arranged in parallel rows. Unlike hyaline and elastic cartilage, fibrocartilage does not have a perichondrium. There are two forms of bone or osseous connective tissue: compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone usually forms the hard outer shell of bones. Concentric rings of bone, called lamellae, form cylindrical structures known as osteons. Each osteon has a central canal that connects to a network of tiny branching passageways called canaliculi. The central canal and canaliculi contain blood vessels. Osteocytes, or mature bone cells, occupy lacunae, small spaces, between neighboring lamellae. Spongy bone, also known as cancellous bone, usually forms inside of bones. It does not contain osteons. Slender bony plates, called trabeculae, form a bony network. The spaces between trabeculae contain bone marrow and blood vessels. Osteocytes are scattered throughout the trabeculae. The combination of compact and spongy bone allows bones to be both strong and lightweight. Fluid connective tissue is represented by blood. The formed elements of blood, specifically its cells and cell fragments, include erythrocytes, or red blood cells, leukocytes, or white blood cells, and platelets. The watery ground substance of blood contains dissolved protein fibers.
Okay, now on to the supporting connective tissue. Again, we said that we have cartilage and we have bone. So these are the two types of connective tissue, cartilage and bone. And of course, we have our blood. So our blood is our fluid connective tissue, and I will write blood in red here. Blood, blood. And I will study blood a lot more detail later on when we get to the cardiovascular system. But here's a smear of human blood here. And you'll see that the ground substance, the ground matrix of blood is something called plasma. It's almost clear, it's kind of a clear yellow color. It's watery, so lots of water in there, as well as protein fibers. Then you have your red blood cells, which here look pink. But these red blood cells are nice donut shaped if this person's healthy. And the fancy term for a red blood cell is an erythrocyte. So erythro means red, cytes means cells. So these are your red blood cells. Of course, someone who has the disease sickle cell anemia, they would not have nice donut-shaped red blood cells like that. They'd be sickled because of a mutation to the hemoglobin protein. So we'll talk more about that when we get to the cardiovascular system. And you'll see scattered white blood cells called leukocytes in there. So we have different kinds of leukocytes. This one here is a neutrophil. This one here is a lymphocyte. So when we go in more detail about blood, you'll actually be able to learn all the different types of leukocytes, white blood cells, and be able to identify them under a microscope. So again, leuko means white, cytes is cells, so these are your white blood cells. And the other thing you have scattered in your fluid connective tissue called blood are little things here called platelets. So platelets are very important. There's a platelet right there. So they tend to be really tiny. There's one right there and scattered. Your platelets are basically fragments of blood cells, but they're very important because this is how you're able to have clotting occur. So if you get a cut, you don't want to just bleed forever. So platelets will come to the site and coagulate, and therefore a series of very complex, we call it a cascade of protein metabolism is going to occur, and you're actually going to get a plug there that will cause the clot. So later on when we get to immune response, we will learn exactly how the clotting mechanism works. And it's quite complicated. It involves a lot of proteins, but it's absolutely fascinating. It's amazing that these little fragments of blood cells can do all that. So, but anyway, blood is that last category, fluid connective tissue. Okay, so that is the connective tissue. So we've talked about epithelial tissue in the last lecture. We talked about connective tissue in this lecture. Again, just real quick, just to summarize again, 3 categories: connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, fluid connective tissue. The only fluid connective tissue is blood. The supporting connective tissue, we have cartilage and we have our bone. Bone, there's 2 types, compact and what's the other one? Spongy, okay. And for cartilage, we have hyaline, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Over to the connective tissue proper, 2 categories, dense and loose. The dense, we have regular, irregular, and elastic. And under the loose, we have areolar, adipose, and reticular. So I hope you're able to know those different categories and what the functions and the characteristics are of those categories. Okay, epithelial, connective. Let's move on to our 3rd category of tissues. So this is no longer connective tissue. This is another kind of just general tissue, and that is muscle tissue. So you guys know what muscles are, but you may not know all the different types of muscle tissues. So the first type we'll talk about is skeletal. So right here is a picture of skeletal muscle tissue. And this is the kind of muscle tissue you normally think about for muscles. This is your biceps, your triceps, your quadriceps, your sternocleidomastoid, whatever muscle you're talking about that is visible and that is under your conscious control. It's voluntary, meaning I can tell myself to raise my arm. That I just moved some skeletal muscles to be able to do that. My conscious brain can tell my arm to flex those muscles. So that is skeletal muscle. And the dead giveaway for skeletal muscle under the microscope are these striations, the stripes. So check out those striations. Aren't they cool? And you'll see, kind of rows of these stripes. So those are called striations. We say that skeletal muscle is striated. The other dead giveaway is that along each of these bands of striated muscle, you see kind of a band here that includes several nuclei. So this is a nucleus, and this is a nucleus, and this is a nucleus. And notice how they're kind of stretched out, they're kind of long, and they're all pretty much lined up. So you got a row of nuclei here, and then you got a row of nuclei there, etc. So striated muscle cells are multinucleated. That means they have more than one nucleus in each cell. And because the striated tissue kind of pushes everything towards the edge of the cell, just kind of like what we learned about adipose tissue pushing the organelles and the nucleus to the edge of the cell membrane. That's what's happening here. These nuclei are pushed, and so what you see here is the edge of the cell membrane, and these nuclei are just pushed up against it. And same thing here. So they're pushed up against that. So that's skeletal muscle tissue. Of course, we're going to be spending a lot of time in A&P studying muscles. You'll not only be able to name all the muscles and their actions, but we're going to look at the histology of muscle, and you'll be able to see exactly why these stripes occur, what's going on in terms of the proteins and how they interact with each other. And then we have cardiac muscle. So that's what we see here. This is a second type of muscle tissue, cardiac muscle, which obviously is only found in your heart, right? So that's where you find cardiac stuff. Notice that the tissue is not as uniform as it is in the skeletal. And in fact, the actual cells kind of have a Y-shaped appearance. It's kind of hard to see here, but you can kind of trace kind of how they have that Y-shaped appearance here. But what's cool is that between each of the cells are these little bands, and they're called intercalated discs. Okay, intercalated discs. These things are amazing because really what they are, remember how we talked about how cells are really close together in epithelium? Well, in cardiac tissue as well, and the openings between the cell membranes allow these cells to communicate with each other. So they exchange sodium, which causes electrical changes between the two cells. So this allows these cells to communicate with each other and hence beat together. So we'll get a lot more into that when we talk about the cardiovascular system in the heart. I mean, it's just fascinating stuff. And you'll notice that the nuclei of the cells are kind of scattered, so they're not all pushed into one line like they are in skeletal muscle. But there's an intercalated disc right there, etc. And then the third type of muscle tissue is smooth muscle tissue, and that's what you see here. And you can see how compared to the cardiac and the skeletal, it looks kind of smooth. You're not seeing any striations. The nuclei are kind of scattered, and it's not really as uniform as what you see in skeletal muscle, but it kind of is still a little bit parallel. So that's smooth muscle. So smooth muscle is involuntary, and by the way, cardiac is also involuntary, but smooth is involuntary. That means you cannot consciously control it. You can't tell it to contract or not. That's all under the part of your brain that is involuntary. It's just like breathing, right? You're not telling yourself to do normal breathing. You just do it. So these line the bronchioles of the lungs. They line the walls of organs like the digestive system, your bladder from the urinary system, your reproductive system, the walls of your arteries and your veins. So anything that's not under conscious control but needs to constantly be able to contract or relax, that is caused by smooth muscle. And our final type of tissue that we're going to briefly go over is nervous tissue. And obviously nervous tissue involves the nervous system. So we're talking about your motor neurons, the neurons that are in your brain, etc. So here is a typical motor neuron. That means a neuron that is going to connect to muscles, for example, or between other neurons together. So you find nervous tissue in your brain, your spinal cord, and your nerves that run throughout your body. So typical neuron is going to have a large part here called the body. Okay, so that is your cell body of your neuron. And little projections off of that body that are going to receive signals from other neurons. And those are called your dendrites. And then there will be a long branch coming off of there that will meet up with either another cell or muscle tissue. And that's where the signal, so it receives a signal from something else, processes through the cell body and out to the axon, where certain chemical processes are going to occur, which you'll learn about later when we go over the nervous system. But it'll send that signal down to something, for example, a muscle, and that will give it the signal to contract. So that long arm there where the signal is transferred is called the axon. And then around nervous tissue, you'll have little supporting cells. So you'll learn all about this when we get to the nervous system. Okay, so neurons conduct impulses. They do it chemically. This is what's fascinating. They create electrical signals using chemicals. And then the axon sends the signals. The cell body has all the organelles, the nucleus, that's your metabolic center that receives the signal from the dendrites. So the dendrites are the first to receive those signals.